This week's TribCast is sponsored by South by Southwest. Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for Tuesday, February 17th, 2026. I am Matthew Watkins, Editor-in-Chief of the Tribune. My co-host Eleanor Klibanoff is off today, covering the rollout of early voting and traveling for reporting. It is, of course, the first day of early voting, so hope you are, making your way to the polls. And I just want to give a quick shout out before we get started to our live TribCast next week, February 24th in Austin, 9 a.m. If you want to hear us preview those primaries, both the Republican and the Democratic, can join me and Eleanor live in Austin in our downtown studios. You can find that at texastribune.org/events. But today we're not going to talk about the primaries. We're going to talk about an unusual incident that happened in El Paso last week. Many of you, I'm sure, know last Wednesday, El Pasoans woke up to find that their airport had been shut down for 10 days due to national security concerns. The restrictions didn't end up lasting nearly that long. They were lifted essentially that same day, but they did bring a good amount of political turmoil, infighting within the federal government, and anxiety and fear on the ground in El Paso. And they've raised a lot of further questions about the government's border security operations and their impacts on the lives of people who actually live across the Rio Grande from Mexico. Joining us to talk about this today is my friend Robert Moore, CEO of Paso Matters. Moore founded Paso Matters in 2019 as a nonprofit news site to use journalism to expand civic capacity in our region. And in that time, he's established it as what's in my book, sort of the leading local news source in El Paso. Bob, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Matthew. It's good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. So I wanted to start by, if you could just sort of walk me through your morning on this day when news sort of broke. I know you had a story up on your website very early, in El Paso, even earlier for you, given that El Paso is in mountain time. How did this sort of land, and what went through your mind as this happened?
So I was actually going to bed. It's about 11 o'clock, and I was settled in, and I keep my phone by the bed just because it's an old journalistic habit. And I got two dings on my phone at about 11:15, indicating I got text messages. And my initial instinct was this certainly can wait until the morning, and I was going to just let it go. But you can relate to this. There's no way I wasn't going to look at it.
Yeah.
So after a minute, I did look at it, and it was the first of what became two notices from elected officials from El Paso that the FAA was about to implement an order shutting down the airspace over El Paso for 10 days, which it took me a little while to process that.
Yeah.
And fortunately, my wife is a licensed drone pilot and is somewhat familiar with FAA regulations and how to find stuff. So I got up and I, opened up my computer, found the air restrictions, and what really caught my attention was that these air restrictions authorize use of deadly force for any planes viewed as a threat. That woke me up. And so that set me off on what would turn out to be a 17-hour journey. I actually did not sleep for about 38 consecutive hours as this from the prior day, and then as this was unfolding. So we got our initial story up just a little after midnight. I think we were the first news organization to report on this. And then we kept kind of updating it throughout the morning. And as you indicated, by about 6 a.m. local time here, the FAA had lifted the El Paso restrictions. But interestingly enough, and this didn't get a whole lot of attention, there was a parallel flight restriction in a part of New Mexico just west of El Paso. And that stayed in effect for another 2 days. And I'm happy to talk about sort of my theories on that. But the big thing was that there was no explanation to this. There's no communication with local folks. So obviously the only comparison anybody has to these flight orders is 9/11.
Right.
So it's like, oh my God, what is happening here? The Trump administration has talked openly about, bombing drug labs in Mexico, so we're worried about that. And there's just no explanation whatsoever. And then as the hours unfolded and as the days unfolded, we got a lot of explanation. And it comes down to just good old fashioned government competence at every level. So that's sort of the short version.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned, while you're working through the night, I am blissfully asleep, unaware that any of this is going on. But then I wake up, pretty early to help start getting my kids ready for school, and I see this and have that sort of disoriented reaction of like, am I still dreaming? Like, are we under invasion right now? You mentioned, the only real comparison the last time this had happened was on September 11th, right? And so that's like the sort of context when these things go on. I mean, my understanding from your reporting, from other people's reporting, is that local officials did not get any kind of like heads up or advance warning on this. I mean, what are they saying to you? What are their reactions to this in those early hours, as there don't seem to be any answers here?
Well, most local officials were finding out from us,
Yeah.
and so like the general reaction is, Bob, what can you tell us? And I was like,
Mm.
I don't know. And so when you've got the local leadership of the community trying to get information about what happened from a journalist who hasn't now slept in a full day, I mean, it's not a recipe for success. And the Congresswoman Escobar was involved in trying to reach out to the folks at the FAA to get answers. I was able, interestingly enough, in the restriction notice, there was actually a phone number. Like, if you need more information about this restriction, call this number. So I
Mm.
did. It was a 202 number in DC, and I got this poor guy at the FAA. And I said, and I identified myself that I'm a journalist. I said, can you tell me what's going on? And he said, I can't. And it's not because I won't. It's because I don't know. They just
Mm.
handed me this and said to post it. So again, that was not particularly reassuring. And so there was, by the time the restrictions got lifted with no explanation, you did have the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, post a tweet early about a drone impeding in the airspace, and it was taken out, and we had to do this. So that was I'll just say that was a lie, right? That didn't happen, uh, uh, and and it's kind of very typical of what happens a lot with the Trump administration. For those of us on the border, it's like whatever the truth is, like default to some kind of attack from Mexico, whether it's drones or people or whatever. And the truth is, those of us who live on the border know that there have been drone incursions across the border since drones got invented. Essentially, they happen all the time, and I'm not saying that's a good thing. Clearly, the cartels are using it primarily as a surveillance technique to try to figure out where the border patrol is. But those incursions aren't viewed as a threat to our airspace. And it turns out what is viewed as a threat to our airspace by the FAA is the Border Patrol firing off lasers with no real discussion about the safety of
Right. And so this is what sort of becomes revealed over time in the 24 hours after this happens, is essentially that the US Department of Defense was using a new, or Homeland Security was using a new high-end energy laser weapon to take out drones, what they believed were drones being used by Mexican cartels to smuggle drugs across the border. This laser is essentially being used pretty close to the El Paso airport, causing the FAA to determine that this is unsafe. It's unsafe for planes to fly, you know, to the airport in this case, right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, and so lots of interesting things to unpack there for those of us who live here.
Hmm.
Uh, so one is, why are they testing lasers at Fort Bliss? The military has a massive testing facility an hour up the road at White Sands Missile Range, which has, by the way, cleared airspace from ground to orbit that nobody can fly over
Hmm.
for exactly this reason. And so, for whatever reason, the Department of Defense is testing these lasers. I think reported from the New York Times and some others later said that this has been going on since about 2024. And then in January of this year, the Secretary of Defense, or I'm sorry, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, told the Army to share their weapons with the Department of Homeland Security. So at some point in January, DHS, which is almost certainly Border Patrol, gets access to these laser weapons, and that apparently is where the FAA gets a little bit nervous. They'd been in conversations with the Department of Defense around these issues and hadn't made any headway. And then they really ran into obstacles trying to work with Homeland Security. And, you know, right, that's the FAA's job
Mm-hmm.
is to keep airspace safe. And some of the reporting that's come out nationally has been that the relationship between the FAA and the Department of Defense have been really strained since last year when you had the tragic accident at Reagan Airport in DC, where an Army helicopter collided with an airplane coming in to land. So those tensions exist as sort of a backstory here. And so apparently they were supposed to have a meeting on February 20th to talk about it. The FAA wanted that meeting moved up. Nothing really happened with that. And then when you had this deployment of the laser near El Paso International, that's when the border or the FAA said, okay, we have to act and we have to put in this restriction. And the restriction they wound up putting in is just insane. So they shut down the airspace around El Paso and then the Secretary of New Mexico for 10 days, starting late at night on February 10th, supposed to run through February 20th. This restriction grounded military, grounded public safety flights, it grounded air ambulances, like everything. El Paso was a no-fly zone. That is an unprecedented restriction, both in length of time and scope of restrictions at a major city. Even after 9/11, things weren't that drastic. They allowed public safety flights and some other flights to continue. So also, because there's no conversation with local leadership, this is like massively disruptive to the local economy of the nation's 23rd largest city. El Paso International Airport is a major economic engine, not just for passenger flights, but for cargo flights. Hospitals rely on getting medical goods flown in on a just-in-time inventory basis. So this was a threat to our economy. It was a threat to public safety. It was a threat to public health, and no conversations at all from the federal government to the local government. And also, it's worth noting that El Paso International Airport is a city-owned airport. They own this property, and obviously they're going to have people coming in a few hours looking to catch flights. The airlines weren't notified, so it was just this sprawling mess.
Is there any? Have you heard or seen in El Paso Matters reporting? Like, did this have? It happened during a sort of low flight traffic time, right? I'd imagine there's not a lot of El Paso flights coming in at, after midnight, but did this actually impact operations in any way? Were there, air ambulance or flights into El Paso that were disrupted because of this?
Yeah, so there were medevac helicopter flights that were rerouted to Las Cruces in southern New Mexico. Um, uh, Fortunately, none of them, as far as we could tell, were carrying level one trauma patients. University Medical Center in El Paso is the only level one trauma center in the region. If somebody had been in a bad traffic accident or had been shot in some kind of outlying area, they would not have gotten the medical care that they needed. But there were some disruptions, and also um, the airlines wound up canceling 14 flights that were in and out of El Paso International in the morning. They had to preemptively take those out, and then once the restrictions were lifted, fortunately, there weren't any other disruptions to passenger traffic. Anyhow, there's a total of 14 flights that got canceled.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think like nationally, this was viewed as sort of a crazy, wild, experience, and in some people's perspectives, almost a sort of comical like example of the dysfunctioning federal government, right? But I mean, it did. I was sitting there watching this sort of play out that during that day, and I think it did really kind of lay out why you want a functioning professional government that communicates with each other and operates with an understanding of the risks and what's important going on, and is communicating and all the different things that you ask for your government, that it does have real impacts, right? People did have their flights canceled. I think lucky to that there wasn't some kind of major accident or anything like that during that time, but like people's lives really could have been at risk here if due to this miscommunication and maybe a lack of understanding of the impact of their actions here. I want to talk a little bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, there were people who bugged out of El Paso when there was this uncertainty. And it's like, if something's going to happen here, I don't want to be here when it happens. And
Yeah.
so they kind of jumped in their car and drove off until the all clear sounded. So I think the one thing, all those impacts you lay out are real, but I think the other thing not to lose sight of is that you had 800,000 people living here who are waking up in the morning, or in some cases staying awake through the night.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell is about to happen to me? What decisions do I need to make for my family? Those are pretty serious implications of this failure too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, let's pause for a second to hear from our sponsors, and then we'll talk a little bit more about their reaction on the ground in El Paso. This episode is brought to you by South by Southwest 2026. This March 12th through 18th, Innovation Conference will take over Austin, Texas. For one electric week, the city becomes a playground for boundary pushing ideas, world class networking, and emerging technology. This is your chance to gain real access to new ideas, people, and opportunities that don't happen anywhere else. Secure your badge at sxsw.com/TribCast. One more time, that's sxsw.com/TribCast. TRIBCAST. Okay, so Bob, this then set off a lot of anger by the mayor, the local members of Congress, and everything like that. Tell me a little bit about just what folks have been saying, from the leadership capacity in El Paso in the days following this.
Now, the main message was that not communicating with local partners is unacceptable and dangerous. And you're right, there was a lot of anger initially. Mayor Renard Johnson, who is a pretty laid back guy and not a boat rocker, he was really, really upset and really more outspoken than I've seen him in the year he's been in office. Really, really critical about what had happened. Congresswoman Escobar, who was kind of on the front lines of having to deal with the federal government, also extraordinarily frustrated with not being able to get information. And then, I think we also have to acknowledge that there are others who I think for partisan reasons weren't particularly critical. Congressman Tony Gonzalez, who represents a part of El Paso, and interestingly, in the last redistricting fight, was trying to get the legislature to throw El Paso International Airport into his district unsuccessfully. He basically has not had anything to say other than, oh, we need to kind of figure out where things might have went wrong. Senator Cruz, I think, has been a little bit more outspoken, kind of saying we need a briefing. The Congresswoman Escobar and three members of Congress from New Mexico have requested a classified briefing from the affected executive agencies. They asked the two Texas senators and Congressman Gonzalez to join in that letter, and they didn't. So even in this really serious moment for El Paso, and really, I think, to be frank, a warning sign of dysfunction for our government that we really ought to be paying attention to. You're still seeing this kind of partisan breakdown here, where Republicans and Democrats seem unable to come together and say, let's fix this problem together. I think that this is a hugely embarrassing moment for the Trump administration, I'm sure, but their embarrassment shouldn't be our principal concern right now. I think public safety and trying to make sure that a bunch of things don't happen again, like make sure we don't have government agencies firing off experimental lasers in airspace near major cities. Make sure that the FAA has more clear policies on when to impose flight restrictions over major areas. All of these should be sort of nonpartisan or bipartisan sorts of points of agreement, but because of our broken political system, we can't even get there right now.
Right, 100%. And we talk about the deploying of this laser, right? And Sean Duffy, among other people, saying that they were shooting at a drone. I mean, among the things that were reported by the New York Times and other national media is that it wasn't actually a drone they shot down, but rather what has been described as a party balloon. And I think in another New York Times article, it kind of described it as a sort of metallic, like one of those you know, balloons you buy at the grocery store that, for a kid's party. Which, I mean, a lot of people laughed at and chuckled at, again, to show dysfunction. But again, I think it's just worth repeating, right? That dysfunction has human impacts. It, terrifies hundreds of thousands of people. It shuts down travel and all those different types of things. But I mean, I feel like it also raised a question in my mind, and I'm curious about how you think about this as someone who actually lives in this community, around just the understanding of how life is actually experienced in the border, right? There's been, for across administrations for a very long time, of course, places like El Paso and other along Texas and New Mexico and California and Arizona, conversations about, the whether the border is lawless and all those different issues that are going on, whether even people in government might have a sort of caricature of the border as opposed to the reality. And this sort of act of shooting down a balloon thinking that it's a cartel drone, sort of puts that into sharp relief. What about that? I mean, are people sort of, did that kind of aspect of that hit home with people in El Paso this past week?
Yeah, and I want to start by saying mistakenly shooting down a balloon is objectively funny and should be mocked.
Fair enough.
I don't hold that against
Yeah.
anybody. But I think the one thing, and I may be sensitive because I live here, but the one thing that really jumps out at me from this whole saga is there was never any discussion at any point about the people who live here, right?
Mhm.
And in this decision-making chain and the federal government, there's really no hey, if we fire off this laser, could there be some disruption to the hundreds of thousands of people who live here, and not to mention the 1.2 million people on the other side of the border? No conversation that I've seen from anybody in the FAA, like what would a decision to shut down airspace do for El Paso? There's no sense that there are real people who live here and there are lives that are going to be affected. And as you indicated, That's not a new phenomenon here, unfortunately. And while it has happened across administrations, as you indicate, I don't want to give the Trump administration a pass here. It is far more pronounced in both Trump's first term and second term. It's not an accident that the Trump administration in Trump 1 began the family separation policy in El Paso. It's not a coincidence that Trump came to El Paso to do a build the wall thing without any kind of real indication of what the people on the ground thought. And it's certainly not an accident that Trump decided to come to El Paso in the days after the Walmart mass shooting in 2019, despite unanimous bipartisan pleading from people in El Paso to stay away because the community was hurting. So there's no recognition that there are human beings with real needs and fears and concerns and hopes and dreams. El Paso is sort of this handy political prop, which I think Sean Duffy immediately plays into. It's like, oh, we shot down this drone that came over. He knew that wasn't true, but it's a message that plays very well with the base. And I think all people, even if you don't live here on the border, should have some concerns about, I think, the overlooking of the humanity that's here. El Paso is not a perfect city. We've got, like any other community, we've got flaws, we've got challenges and things like that. But there are good people who live here, and people just wanting to take care of their families and be able to go to work, be able to board a flight, be able to come home from a business trip. All of that was just sort of invisible to the decision makers in this whole chain of events.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sort of had me thinking about that. Like the explanation that we were shooting down a drone, using this dangerous laser, we had to do this, makes a lot more sense if you are bought into the idea of the border as a almost like sort of war zone, where like communities are under siege, right? And um whether he believed that or not, it was probably a message that, to a certain segment of society of our population, made it seem like a more rational choice to deploy that laser. But again, like even that, I mean, that's frustration that has gone back for a very long time, of this idea of like, well, that's not exactly how people in El Paso experience living here. It's not a place of lawlessness and disorder. It's a growing community.
Yeah, it's a vital community, and it's important for the country. It is a huge economic engine for Texas, for example. Um, the Because of our isolation, a lot of Texans kind of lose sight of that, and I get that. We're in a different time zone from everyone else, and it can be kind of hard to get here. But El Paso is a vital part of Texas, and we feel connected to the state here. I think all of that kind of gets lost in the political shuffle.
What about just like broadly, like how does El Paso feel different now than maybe it did 2 years ago? I mean, there have been times in recent years, particularly in the Biden administration, where I know local officials were really concerned about the amount of migrants coming over, being released. There were times where El Paso was busing migrants to other destinations because they felt like their services were being overwhelmed. We are now in a time, of course, where border crossings, border encounters have dramatically shifted, in large part because of the actions that the Trump administration has taken. But there are also, I know, concerns about the militarization of the community and things like that. Just what is different about El Paso in February 2026 than February 2024?
Yeah, I think first of all, to understand, even at the height of migration, when there were some really, really difficult things happening here, people sleeping outside in the dead of winter, by the hundreds, um, uh, most of that never impacted the daily life of El Pasoans. believe it or not, there are things that happen here other than migration, right? And so I think that's an important thing to understand. So the lives of El Pasoans have not changed dramatically because of the change in immigration policies. People still go about their business here like they always have. The community remains very safe by U.S. standards. Crime rate that's much lower than what you see in other major cities. I think El Pasoans, by and large, are more worried about getting jobs that pay well here, so that they can raise a family. El Paso's biggest issue is we are exporting young adults. You mentioned earlier that El Paso is a growing community. It turns out that's really not accurate. El Paso is a community that's dealing with population stagnation because of economic challenges, primarily our low wage structure here. So those issues really rise a lot more. For people who do deal directly with migration, it's obviously been a huge change. The Trump administration does like to say that it hasn't released any migrants from custody since it took office. That may not surprise anybody. It turns out not to be true. There are still shelters here that are taking in people who have been released by Border Patrol or ICE for various reasons. One of the issues we're dealing with now, and the Tribune has written about this too, is this rapid rise in habeas corpus petitions that are overwhelming the federal court system, because El Paso has become sort of this major holding area. We have the largest ICE detention facility in the country here. And that's taken in a lot of people from Minnesota in the last month. Those people are filing habeas corpus petitions seeking their release, largely with success, both in El Paso and some other areas of the Western District of Texas. So that's been the primary migration issue we're seeing. Again, if you're not a lawyer, or you're not on the front lines of providing assistance to migrants, you're probably not aware of it. Or unless you're a loyal reader of El Paso Matters or Texas Tribune, maybe you're aware of it. Yes. But the issues kind of have receded further into the background.
All right. Well, if you are not a loyal reader of El Paso Matters or Texas Tribune, you should be. It's elpasomatters.org. Thank you, Bob. This has been really valuable. I appreciate your insights. I also want to say thank you to Rob and Chris, our producers, and thank you to our sponsors, South by Southwest. Secure your badge again at sxsw.com/TribCast. And also join us for the live TribCast on February 24th at 9 a.m. texastribune.org/events for that. Bob, it's been great talking with you. We'll be back next week for another TribCast.